arrived at the trailhead before the last light folded behind the ridge. The call had come in 2 hours earlier. Someone reported scratching around an old cabin, something moving along the beams and under the deck. They said it wasn't a coyote. They said it wasn't anything they recognized. My job wasn't to argue, so I drove out with the standard kit: traps, snare poles, thermal reader, and a battered radio that never held a charge long enough to matter. The woods were quiet when I parked. Too quiet for that hour. It felt like the air was moving in the wrong direction, sliding toward me instead of drifting downhill like it usually does before nightfall. I stepped out, checked the wind, checked the temperature, checked the map the client had sent. The cabin sat a little farther up the trail, maybe a 7-minute walk if I didn't stop. The sun hadn't dropped yet. I still had 8 minutes. That detail stuck with me for reasons I couldn't explain. I unpacked my gear at the edge of the trail. The metal buckles made small, sharp sounds against the box. Everything around me seemed to absorb the noise instead of carrying it. Even my footsteps felt muted, as if the forest had laid down a hand over the ground and pressed it still. When I raised my head, the cabin was visible between the branches. One window glinted with a dull reflection, then another. 2 identical silhouettes stood behind the glass, the shapes fixed and symmetrical, as though someone had cut them out and pinned them there. I wiped the lens of my handheld scope and looked again. Same shape, same placement, same stillness. The forest shifted. Not with movement, just a sensation. A kind of slow pressure that made the hour feel later than it was. My watch ticked steadily, second by second, but the woods behaved as if night had already settled in. I checked the horizon. There was still color in the sky. The contrast didn't make sense. I tested the trail with the butt of my pole. Dry soil, light debris, nothing fresh. The prints I expected: raccoon, stray dog, whatever the caller claimed had been pacing around, weren't there. Instead, the dirt had a smoothed surface, like something had passed repeatedly and erased its own tracks each time. A shift of air slid down from the cabin roof cold. Not the temperature drop kind of cold, but the kind that comes when a door opens somewhere you can't see. I scanned the porch, the deck boards, the support beams. Nothing. I heard the click before I realized what it belonged to. My radio had turned on by itself. The dial wasn't touched. The switch was still in the off position, but the static came through clearly, a clear channel instead of the usual broken hum. I lifted it, pressed the side, waited for the interference to fade. Instead, a voice came through. Not loud, not urgent, just close. Check the time. I froze. The words were clean, unbroken, without the distortion that radio signals usually picked up out here. The tone wasn't familiar, but it carried none of the strain or fear that a caller in danger would have. I looked around the clearing, expecting to see someone standing behind me. Nothing. The cabin windows were empty now. The silhouettes had vanished. The forest gave no sign that the voice had come from anywhere real. I tapped the radio. Silence. Tapped it again. Nothing. The channel was dead. The trail ahead looked unchanged, the same as when I arrived, narrow, quiet, unbent by anything larger than a deer, but the air around it felt shifted, like someone had taken 8 minutes and stretched them out across the path, waiting for me to step inside them. I checked my watch. The sun hadn't set yet. Not according to my time, anyway. And then part 2 began to form in my mind, not with an event, but with the simple fact that something in the forest didn't agree with my clock. My watch said I still had light. Everything else said otherwise. The trail absorbed the last line of daylight the moment I stepped onto it. I glanced at the horizon again, expecting to see the usual fading orange, but the sky had dropped into a darker shade, a kind of premature dusk that didn't match my watch. When I raised the light, the beam looked normal for a second. Then it shortened, as if something in the air bent it back toward me. I tilted the flashlight upward. The beam frayed before it reached the branches. It wasn't distance. It wasn't fog. It just stopped, cut clean as though the trail ahead refused to let light travel. I checked the battery compartment out of habit. Full charge. I swept the beam left, then right. Each time, the glow lasted no more than a few feet before it thinned into nothing. The air pressed down in a way it hadn't moments earlier. The temperature wasn't the problem. It was the stillness. Somewhere behind me, something dragged along the dirt. Not footsteps. Not the shuffle of a large animal. It sounded more like a crate being pulled across an uneven floor. A heavy, steady drag. I turned, angled the light toward the noise. Nothing moved. The path behind was empty, the leaves untouched. The dragging sound didn't match what I saw, and that discrepancy held my attention longer than it should have. I waited. Listened. The forest was silent again. I pulled out my GPS tracker to mark my position. The screen refreshed with a soft pulse, then displayed a coordinate I recognized. It was the exact spot where I had parked. I reset it, waited for a new reading. The screen blinked. Same coordinate. Same timestamp. The trail hadn't even begun according to the device I checked the satellite link. Signal strong, connection steady. Nothing should have prevented it from updating. Yet it refused to move forward in time. 8-minute cycles were normal for older handheld units, but mine wasn't that old, and it wasn't supposed to freeze on a static point. A breeze moved across the undergrowth, dry leaves rotated slightly, parting as something tall broke the line of shrubs ahead. She stepped through the brush without sound. A long coat, dark, heavy enough to drag the hem over the ground, her head angled forward just enough to obscure her face. She moved in a straight line across the trail, cutting it cleanly, not turning, not slowing, not acknowledging me in any way. Her steps made no impact, no shift in soil, no pressure on the leaves. Even the coat made no friction noise when it brushed against the plants. But the scent she left behind stayed. A faint trace, dust, cold stone, something older than the cabin above. Not decayed. Just out of place, I swung the flashlight toward where she vanished. The beam dissolved across the space she had passed through. No branches moved. No footprints. Just a lingering smell in the air that didn't align with the season. I marked the spot mentally and kept walking. After several more steps, the trail widened just enough for the cabin to come into view again. The windows were darker now, though I couldn't tell if it was from the light outside or the lack of it inside. The steps leading up to the porch looked uneven, as if someone had modified them recently. Then I noticed the shoes. 2 pairs, placed neatly side by side at the bottom of the steps. Identical shape, identical wear pattern, evenly spaced like items laid out for inspection. I knelt to check them. The soles were burned, blackened across the outer edges, but untouched in the center. The heat markings were recent. The scent hadn't dissipated. It was the smell of rubber heated past the point of ordinary use. Someone had set them on fire intentionally and then brought them here. I touched the laces warm. Behind me, leaves shifted without wind. The dragging noise started again, slow, measured, deliberate. A sound moving closer but never fully arriving. I turned the radio on. Dead signal. The static was too flat, almost as if the device wasn't connected to anything in the world at all. I checked my watch. The minute hand had advanced, but the forest still looked like the moment after sunset. Not deep night, not early dusk, just the wrong hour entirely. My boots sank slightly into the dirt, as if the ground recognized I had crossed some point that wasn't meant to be crossed yet. The cabin walls reflected no light. The windows no longer held silhouettes, but the air carried the same sense of occupancy, like the space already knew I was there. I should have logged the time, I should have marked each step. Something about the trail made the moments indistinguishable. Every sound felt delayed, out of order. Every breath came back colder than it should have. I lifted the flashlight again, and the beam cut off at the same abrupt distance, as though the trail continued only when I didn't look directly at it. Farther up, between the porch beams, a shadow crossed from left to right. Not a person, not an animal. A movement with weight, but no form. The dragging sound stopped. The woods held their breath. Something waited for the next part of the 8 minutes to begin, and in that stillness, I realized my watch hadn't been wrong. The light hadn't been wrong. Only the trail had shifted. I could feel it in the dirt, in the timber, in the air that refused to settle. I hadn't stepped into night, I had stepped into the beginning of whatever those 8 minutes contained. And in that moment, I knew the 8 minutes hadn't passed yet. The cabin door resisted when I touched it, the wood cold in a way that didn't match the air outside. The handle didn't turn. There was no keyhole, no latch, nothing that would explain why it felt locked. I pressed again, checking for a shift in the hinges. It stayed still. Then something moved behind it. Not toward me, but away. A slow, steady weight sliding across the floorboards, followed by the muted thump of a door inside the cabin opening and closing. It didn't make sense. The only entrance was the one in front of me. Nothing should have been able to leave unless it passed where I stood. I stepped back and listened. The shift of weight continued deeper inside, a progression from one room to another, as though someone was exiting through spaces I couldn't see from outside. When the sound reached the far wall, it stopped, leaving the cabin in a silence that pressed against the trail. I circled the porch, checking for any secondary entry windows. A boarded seam, an uneven frame where the boards didn't align with the foundation. Nothing that would allow movement in or out. I returned to the front and found the door slightly ajar. I hadn't touched it. I watched it. No one had passed me, but the hinge had loosened enough for the upper gap to widen. I nudged it open with the end of my pole. The interior light didn't shift. There was no bulb, no lantern. Yet the space was visible enough to navigate, illuminated by a dim, colorless glow that seemed to rise from the floor instead of fall from above. The first thing I saw was the table. A single sheet of paper rested at the center, weighed down by a smooth river stone. The handwriting was blunt, almost carved into the surface. It didn't say "do not enter." It didn't say "keep out." It said, "do not go back." The message didn't point to a threat inside the cabin. It pointed to the trail behind me, the one I had already walked. I lifted the paper. The underside was clean. No marks, no pressure dents beyond the writing. The stone smelled faintly of smoke. I set it down and scanned the room. Against the far wall hung a clock. A simple one. Thin hands, white face, no numbers. Its minute hand sat between two markers, not aligned, either frozen mid-stride. When I blinked, the hand trembled, barely, then stopped again. I waited, watched, listened. After several breaths, it shifted the smallest distance possible, just enough to suggest movement, not enough to indicate time had passed. When I checked the second hand, it wasn't moving at all. I tapped the glass. The minute hand jumped backward by 1 mark. I tapped again. It returned to the exact same position as before. I checked my own watch. 8 minutes hadn't elapsed, but the cabin clock insisted it had moved through 8 different positions and returned to the same one each time, as though it kept losing track and restarting. On the floor beneath the clock lay fragments of something burned. Small pieces of rubber, curled by heat. Thread remnants. A lace tip melted on one end's shoes. The same type I had seen outside. The same burn pattern. Pieces arranged in a crescent shape, like someone had tried to line them up but stopped halfway. I crouched, picked up a fragment. Warm, not fresh from fire, fresh from being handled. I checked the boards beneath, expecting scorch marks. The wood was clean. The light dimmed for a moment. Not the room, my flashlight. It flickered, then cut out entirely, though the interior remained visible. I stepped back toward the door frame and swept my gaze toward the nearest window. Someone was on the trail. The figure was faint through the reflection, but the outline was unmistakable. Same jacket, same pack, same posture, same speed of movement. They were walking the path I had taken as if retracing my steps. Yet every motion lagged slightly behind what I remembered. Like an echo rendered in a body, I leaned closer to the glass. The figure didn't look toward the cabin. Didn't look at anything. Just moved. When I lifted my hand, the reflection inside the glass shifted in a way that didn't match my own gesture. The figure on the trail didn't respond, but the one reflected did. My radio clicked alive. Static entered first, not the usual hiss, but a layered distortion that sounded like multiple signals crossing without direction. One pattern rose above the rest, then collapsed. I lowered the volume. The static remained. It wasn't reacting to distance, movement, or terrain, only to whatever was occupying the space between me and the trail. The reflection in the window stretched momentarily, pulling into a longer outline before snapping back. The trail figure continued its walk, still facing away from me, still wearing my gear, still following a pace that matched what I had done earlier. I stepped back from the window. The reflection thinned. The trail dimmed. The air shifted just enough for the boards to creak under my weight. The dragging noise from earlier returned. Only this time it didn't seem tied to a distance. It came from the cabin floor, then the walls, then above, not sequential. Simultaneous. Like something was moving through the structure in a way that didn't acknowledge its physical boundaries. The radio caught a brief tone. Not a voice, not a word. Just a low, steady hum that pulsed 3 times, then faded. I checked the cabin door. Still open. The outside light didn't match the inside glow. 2 different hours competing for the same location. The trail figure slowed. The reflection didn't. I stepped outside to reorient myself, the cabin threshold giving way without resistance. The porch boards held steady. The woods around me retained the same airless quiet as before. And then I heard it. Footsteps, not mine, not behind me, not random. Footsteps matching my own pace, shifting in sync with each step I took, as though the trail remembered me and decided to walk in parallel. Outside, the footsteps moved at the same pace as mine. The trail should have stretched downhill in a single line. But as soon as I stepped away from the cabin porch, the ground pulled me into a loop I didn't recognize. The pattern of roots under my boots felt familiar in the wrong way. The same raised knot, the same flat stone, the same 3 broken twigs, angled like arrows toward nowhere I passed them. And the air shifted. A second later, the exact same arrangement appeared again. Not similar, the same. The forest floor felt like it had been copied from an earlier moment and placed ahead of me as if anticipating where I would walk. I scraped my boot across the stone to test the surface. The mark I left dragged across it clearly. When I moved forward, I saw the unmarked version of that same stone 3 steps ahead, clean, untouched, returned to its original state. The air smelled like damp bark and mineral-heavy water. Then the scent snapped back, fresher, sharper, almost metallic. The shift happened without a breeze, the way an old film reel jumps between frames. I kept walking. The beam of my flashlight stretched farther now, though the angle of dusk didn't match the time on my watch. The trail was brighter than it should have been, but the brightness didn't behave like daylight. It was more like ambient glow, light without a source. Ahead, the tall figure in the long coat stood motionless. She was not crossing the trail this time. She was facing the cabin, her back to the woods. Her coat edges still, untouched by the faint wind that finally moved through the branches. I slowed, checked my footing, raised the flashlight. The beam touched her coat first, then the ground at her feet, then her shadow. It split. 2 shadows pulled away from each other, one cast forward, one backward, both originating from a body that didn't shift even slightly. I lowered the beam. The shadows stayed doubled. I raised it again. They separated more sharply. Her outline stayed perfectly still. I stepped sideways to test the angle. The shadows didn't adjust. They didn't respond to my movement or the direction of the light. They stayed in place. 2 shapes belonging to one figure that did not belong to the trail. She remained with her back to me, attention fixed on the cabin as if waiting for something inside to acknowledge her presence. I waited. The woods flattened around me. The trail behind felt longer than it should have been. A smell crept into the air before anything else shifted. Burned rubber, the distinct sourness of heated synthetic fibers, and something underneath, warm, human. The kind of scent that clings to clothes worn long enough to hold sweat and skin oils. The combination was unmistakable, not just burned shoes. Shoes that had been worn recently. Shoes that carried someone's scent. The smell thickened until the air felt coated. It drifted from behind me, from the trail I had already walked, from the place where the loop had begun. I turned. The trail was empty, but the smell was stronger there, as if the source had passed only seconds earlier. I backed up, keeping the flashlight focused on the path. The beam flickered once, then steadied. The figure in the coat didn't move. Her double shadows pulsed faintly, as though breathing. The burning smell increased again. Not just rubber now, threads, adhesive, leather binding layers separating under heat. I knew the scent from controlled burns, but this was too fresh, too present. The ground under me changed texture. Dry leaves a moment ago, moist soil the next. Same spot, different condition. I crouched and touched the surface. Cold, not early evening cool. A colder temperature that suggested the ground no longer matched the hour. When I stood again, the trail had reset. The same 3 twigs, the same stone, the same scuffed root. Everything a perfect copy of the sequence I had walked minutes earlier. I took 3 steps forward. The forest around me shifted again. This time, the smell followed me instead of lingering behind. Something had entered the loop with me. I tested the flashlight again. The beam stretched its full distance, reached the trunks, and then collapsed abruptly. It dimmed, flared, dimmed again. Then the light died completely. I smacked the casing. Nothing. With the light gone, the trail should have darkened. Instead, the brightness increased, returning to the same strange pre-sunset clarity I'd seen when I first crossed the threshold into this segment of trail. It wasn't daylight. It was 8 minutes ago. The coat woman's outline began to fade at the edges, not disappearing but thinning like a projection losing its alignment. Her coat darkened, then lightened, then returned to its original color without any change in fabric. Her two shadows merged briefly, then separated again. I stepped sideways, back toward the cabin. Each step returned a familiar crunch or soft press underfoot. Yet the pattern repeated identically. I could have been standing still. I could have been walking in a sealed corridor built from the same 8 minutes replaying themselves. Behind me, a soft crackling rose, the sound of something igniting, but nothing burned in sight. The warmth moved across the back of my neck, a layer of heat that didn't belong to the trail. The cabin ahead flickered, not the lights. There were none. The structure itself shifted brightness, as though overlaid with an earlier moment. The figure in the coat remained rigid, her face still turned away from me. The burned smell intensified, joined again by that familiar human scent. Not one I recognized, but one that suggested proximity, presence, recent use. The kind of scent that clings to clothing someone has worn long enough to leave part of themselves in the fibers. The trail dimmed again. Then it brightened, snapping cleanly into the same lighting I had walked through when I left the cabin. The loop reformed. The coat woman dissolved. Her two shadows lingered half a second longer, then folded into the ground like dust. I stepped backward. The brightness held steady, but the air told me the minute cycle was starting over again. I checked my watch. The second hand moved. The minute hand did not. I looked up the trail. Everything waited. I turned back toward the cabin. The door was slightly open, same angle as before. The stone on the table still pressed the note down at the same point. The clock inside remained stuck between the same two positions. The woods around me held the same silence. Nothing in front of me changed, but the smell behind me did, shifting from burned rubber to the faint trace of body heat lingering in fabric. Someone had walked that path, someone had been close. Someone had repeated these 8 minutes with me, or before me, or ahead of me. And the trail accepted it. I stepped forward again. The ground responded with the same loop. The lighting shifted the same way. The air held the same stillness. 8 minutes had not ended. The forest reset without warning. I didn't feel a shift in the ground. I didn't feel a change in the air. One moment I was standing in the looped section of the trail, and the next, everything around me had returned to where I had first arrived. Same angle of the horizon, same color of the sky, same muted hum in the branches overhead. The light had rewound. The hour had folded back onto itself. The sun hovered just above the ridge again, not fully set, not fully present, trapped in the same 8-minute window that had followed me through the woods. I checked my watch. The minute hand had moved backward, not gradually, cleanly, as if it had been placed at an earlier position by something other than the gears beneath the glass. My boots sat in the same patch of soil I remembered first stepping on the same ridge of earth, the same dry indentation where the toe of my boot had pressed earlier. Only this time, the mark felt older, as if I had been here more times than I could account for. I turned toward the cabin. 2 silhouettes had stood behind the window when I arrived the first time. Now a third one joined them, taller, thinner, set slightly apart from the other 2. The shape didn't match any posture I had taken, even when considering reflection or angle distortion. The new silhouette was facing the window directly, not sideways, not shifted, as though it was watching the trail through the glass. I took 1 step toward it. The silhouette didn't move. The other 2 didn't move either, but the window darkened around them. A dim halo formed at the edges of their outlines, a kind of shadow that shouldn't exist in that angle of light. My radio clicked alive again. The audio didn't distort this time. No static, no interference, no layered signals. A single voice cut through cleanly. Check the time. Same tone, same distance, same clarity. As if the speaker stood next to me and spoke directly into my ear. I lowered the radio slowly, testing the trail around me, checking for movement. Then I heard footsteps. Farther down, not running, not cautious, just steady, consistent, climbing the trail toward me. Human at first, but not entirely. The cadence was wrong. The heel struck too sharply. The weight distribution was slightly off, leaning too heavily on one side, as though the person walking wore boots designed for a different gait. The rhythm reminded me of someone mimicking human steps without the instinctive shifts of balance we make without thinking. The smell followed shortly after, not the burned rubber from earlier, but warmth. Fabric warmed by body heat. The scent of gear that had been worn for hours. The exact mixture I should have carried on my own clothes. I raised my flashlight, though I already knew it wouldn't behave the same way it had earlier. The beam flickered 3 times, then held. The light extended farther than before, yet the trail didn't brighten the way it should have. The illumination reached out, but the ground accepted only part of it, like a surface that refused full recognition. The footsteps approached the first bend in the path. I steadied the light and waited. A figure emerged from the darkening hillside. At first, it appeared like any hiker, upright, purposeful, carrying equipment that clinked softly with each movement. Then the details resolved. The same jacket, the same pack, the same strap across the shoulder, the same flashlight mount. Every detail matched my own gear with unsettling precision, down to the wear pattern on the strap and the dark stain near the lower pocket. The figure lifted its head slightly, not enough to reveal the face, just enough to acknowledge direction. Its left foot angled outward in the same way mine did after long hours of walking. The exact same habit I had never noticed until I saw it mirrored. The weight in its steps matched mine perfectly. Just a fraction too heavy on the heel, just a fraction too light on the forefoot. Not imitation. Replication. The voice on the radio repeated, "Check the time." The figure slowed. My watch ticked backward 1 more second. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand, though I wasn't shaking. The figure stepped into full view, not 10 feet from where I stood. I lifted my light to see more clearly. The beam reached its face and revealed nothing. No features, no eyes, no mouth. Just a surface that recognized the light and returned it without shape, like a mask molded from the idea of a face rather than the structure of one. Its hand lifted slightly. The same radio hung from its shoulder. The same scuffs on the casing, the same worn grip, the same smear of dirt I had gotten when I dropped mine earlier near the trail entrance. The smell of smoke drifted through the air again. Not from burning now, from clothing that had been near fire, clothing that had been worn by someone who stepped into the same 8-minute loop I had walked. The figure took 1 more step toward me. My radio clicked. The cabin windows flickered. The trail darkened by a fraction of a shade. The figure lifted its other hand, revealing the exact same flashlight I held. Its beam dim, its casing scratched in the same places mine was. I stepped back. It stepped forward. The light between us wavered. The edge of the trail shifted. The ridge swallowed the last sliver of daylight, and in that moment, the 8 minutes closed around us again, sealing the trail into a single repeating breath. Then everything stopped. This has been tonight's record from the White Rabbit Witch. The trail and its minutes do not stay the same, and the moment you step onto it will never match anyone else's. If this story kept you here in the dark, subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. The next record will be delivered as soon as it's ready.